Hello and welcome back, and today I want to talk about some brand new NAS. 2020 has been a weird year for the release schedule, hasn't it? All of the devices that we thought were going to arrive at the end of last year kind of disappeared for a while, and we've waited till almost halfway through 2020 to finally start seeing some decent hardware arrive on the scene. And the two new 4-bays from Synology and QNAP are definitely something that you guys can get behind. They are the Synology DS920 Plus and the QNAP TS-453D. Now, these two NAS devices are definitely bringing a lot to the party. They are very much examples of what both brands have, presented themselves to the end users, home and business users alike. And the 4-bay desktop is kind of the sweet spot for a lot of buyers looking at this kind of technology. External storage devices like USBs are so, but when it comes down to it, NAS is no more than, it used to be just a simple hard drive that we looked at, in network, connected via the network of the internet, and now NAS has turned into its own operating system, and both of these brands are presenting us with the best of their wares in these devices. Now, the 920 is the serviceable follow-up to the very popular 918 from Synology, and the TS-453D is the follow-up to the, again, very popular TS-453Be. Both of these devices are designed to give you, the end user, pretty much the best of what you can get at that price point, allowing a lot of multi-user environments when it comes to multimedia, to backups, to surveillance, Plex media server, ideal business tier backups with a multi-tiered backup strategy and a lot of options in between. But on top of that, both of these devices are designed very much within their own company rhetoric. And because of that, they both represent their own standards very, very highly. Now, what we're going to look at today is several things. We're going to look at design, we're going to look at hardware, and we want to look at software, and ultimately help you decide between them. But before we go any further, let's just cover what they've both got in common. Both of these devices do provide an excellent base for a number of modern NAS applications. They can both be used as a Plex media server to a mid-level degree. They can both be utilized for DLNA media servers. They can both be used for a Mac and Windows and Android and iOS based strategy of all of your backup tiers and synchronization. They can both be used in conjunction with cloud services such as Dropbox and Google Drive, which mean that you can back up the content to the NAS to the cloud, or synchronize the cloud with the NAS and have a multi-tiered strategy, as well as improvements with things like hybrid mount and hybrid share from both companies, meaning that you can make your cloud storage appear localized, and you can interact with your cloud storage utilizing Synology and QNAP software assets. Talking of Synology and QNAP software assets, both of them arrive with their own great surveillance software in Surveillance Station and QVR Pro. Both of them arriving with a great selection of tools that can be utilized within IP cameras, IP speakers, and a bunch of security services with camera licenses included. But there are more licenses on the QNAP than the Synology. We'll touch on that later. On top of that, in terms of software, you've got AI recognition applications with both devices arriving with photo recognition and cataloging services built in, with QMaggie from QNAP and Synology Moments from Synology, obviously. Both of them allow you to index decades of digital photos and get facial recognition along with person and thing recognition, and you can catalog and search photos in a far more intelligent manner rather than just looking at file names. You'll actually know what's in the photos and allow you to search accordingly. On top of that, they've both got lots of business applications available to you, with Docker and Container Station allowing you to create virtual models and virtual sandbox environments of software and interfaces from Linux down to a lot of stuff in GitHub. And they both arrive with support of virtualization with Synology Virtual Machine Manager and QNAP's Virtualization Station. They both arrive with lots of applications to create virtual and remote applications. Talking of virtual and remote, they can both be accessed either locally in your own environment or via the internet. But there are other, divulsions in that we'll talk about later on. On top of that, both of these devices arrive with Intel-based processors. They both arrive with DDR4 memory. They both arrive with what is considered the standard right now in network-attached storage. So regardless of which one of these two you go for, you are going to have a lot to play with and a lot of capabilities open to you. But let's move into our first section, design. In terms of design, both of these NASs have gone very much a different route, and again, they both represent what their respective brands prioritize. The Synology arrives in that, familiar plastic chassis there with the Synology logo that's ventilated on the sides. It's got USB 3 on the front and back for supported compatible devices. We'll talk about that more in the hardware section. And a couple of LAN ports on the rear and an expandable eSATA port. The chassis is very compact. It's a 4-bay. The memory's expandable. Again, we'll touch on that later. But ultimately, the device itself is very compact, nice, square, kind of visually interesting. And of the two, I'd say in terms of aesthetic design, the Synology definitely looks the better. But the QNAP, on the other hand, is designed for a multi-purpose environment. It's designed for a different target market. And again, you will hear me say this a few times in this video and others. The Synology is designed very much in the Mac mold in terms of software and aesthetic design, whereas the QNAP is a lot more about the way Windows and Android users feel about data and processes and the way they like to interact with their data and that kind of thing in their hardware. So in terms of the QNAP, it's a slightly more rounded edged chassis. It's the familiar one that we've seen in its previous generation, but recolored, much like the Synology, but without the recoloring. The QNAP arrives there with a removable front panel. Both of them have got click and load trays. But the Synology arrives, the QNAP arrives with the ventilation far more prevalent on the sides and base. It doesn't have that branded logo that Synology have, but if anything, that chassis does appear to be a little bit more compact. On the rear of the device, you've got so many more ports. You've got your USB 3 ports with 5 ports versus 2. And again, they support those devices, external storage peripheral devices that are compatible. And the QNAP arrives with 2 LAN ports, a single HDMI port, I should say, which is pretty important. I've got to say, and it's HDMI 2.0, so 4K. We'll leave all that for the hardware section, even though I've trod on my toes several times. And it has got a PCIe slot for expandability and a single rear fan. Now, let's talk about that fan for a second. The 453D has got a single fan. The 920 Plus has got 2 smaller fans. Now, there's lots of arguments back and forth. Both of them use plastic chassis with metal internals, and the 2 fans, according to the spec sheets at least, do seem to generate less noise and consume less power than that one big fan. But these are very, very small differences and not really something we can err and give an advantage one over the other on the sake of that fan. What I will say is if you're particularly sensitive to these sort of things with regards to vibrations, or if you're going to be in incredible close proximity with the NAS, this may be a factor in your buying choice. But ultimately, in terms of design, they both very much represent what each brand is putting out there right now. I think the majority of us would agree that the Synology looks probably the more sleek and modern designed of the two. Is very minimalistic, but the QNAP can't afford to have some of those design choices because of just how much capability it's adding externally to the chassis. So you can't really have busy and discrete. It doesn't really work. So next, let's talk about hardware. I've already half touched on it already, but let's really talk about it. They both arrive with the same CPU. That's the Intel Celeron J4125, and it is a 2.0 gigahertz processor that can be burst up to 2.7 gigahertz per core, which is pretty impressive. Let's be honest, that's garnering up to the 3 gigahertz limit there per core. Now, this processor enables things like DDR4, with both of them arriving with 4 gig of DDR4 memory that can be upgraded to 8 gig. And on top of that, this CPU has got UHD HD graphics supported up to 600, which means graphical manipulation is exceptionally good compared to its predecessor. There is a slight overlap, and I will talk about that later in the video, but the CPU allows obviously AES-NI level encryption, so a faster performance overall with encryption enabled. They both arrive with support of 1080p and 4K transcoding, and of course that transcoding will be at its highest limit natively, not utilizing Plex Media Server, which is a little bit more resource intensive, even with a Plex pass and hardware transcoding enabled. They both arrive with that 4 SATA bays built into the front there, which means support of up to the very latest Seagate Iron Wolf hard drives, and that's 16 TB, which is pretty good. And again, that's the biggest commercial NAS drive you can buy right now. On top of that, they both arrive with support of 1 GBE, which I know a number of you were a little bit disappointed by in terms of the Synology. But what's really interesting is the QNAP does support 1 GBE, but it also supports 2.5 GBE environments. That's right. By default, the QNAP, the TS-453D arrives with two 2.5 GBE ports. This is a big, big jump forward in the standard of networking. Now, we don't have a full committed price right now available to us on the 453D. I know the 453Be is arriving at quite a comfortable price point right now, but I think this is quite a significant jump forward, so we might see a noticeable jump in price there. But after this point, after that CPU and the memory, the QNAP just arrives with significantly more hardware, which if you plan on taking advantage of it, makes it very hard to ignore. You've got those 2 times 2.5 GBE ports. You've got 5 USB 3 ports, which is always handy. You've got HDMI 2.0, which allows 4K 60 frames per second direct output, with the QNAP even arriving with dedicated software allowing you to install apps and have its own graphical user interface, its own GUI over HDMI. And that includes things for their own first-party apps, as well as Plex, and you've got Kodi unofficially, as well as Surveillance, LibreOffice, Chrome, all kinds of applications, both official and unofficial, can be run on this device, utilizing that HDMI port. On top of that, you've also got a PCIe expandability built into it with a PCI Gen 2 x4 slot. That means you can add 10 GBE, you can add SSD caching with both NVMe SATA and NVMe M2 and SATA M2 SSD built in. The QM2 card indeed inside that you can install, I should say, it doesn't arrive with it. You can have combined and combo cards that allow you to have both 10 GBE and M2 SSD caching built in. Not just that, you can have Wi-Fi cards built in, you can have sound cards built in. There's quite a lot of compatible PCIe cards on the 453D right now, according to the spec sheets and compared to what we've seen in previous generations from QNAP. Now, I mentioned SSD caching because that is one area of contention here, because if you're going to use SSD caching and you're going to focus a lot on the internal operations of the NAS, with less of a concern about what happens externally, so you're not too worried about the speed in which you access the data, you're more concerned with how the data is processed in the NAS, then the Synology has something for you. Much like its predecessor, the Synology 920 Plus arrives with 2 NVMe SSD bays built in. That's right, you can install 2 NVMe SSDs into this Synology along with the 4 SATA bays, and it allows you to use them in caching to vastly improve the performance of the traditional slower hard drives in that RAID array. Now, this is something Synology have been working on a great deal in newer generation, in slightly older generation devices like the 918 and the 1019. But 3 of the 4 new Synologies that were announced relatively recently all arrive with NVMe M2 SSD cache built in. You do have to buy the drives yourself, so it's just empty bays, much like the hard drive bays, but that SSD caching will vastly improve internal operation speeds on those hard drives. Now, although the QNAP does not arrive with the SSD bays as standard, you can get upgrade cards or even unofficial upgrade cards from other companies to install NVMe SSDs inside this device and have access to that NVMe caching. Why do I bring this up? Because even though it doesn't have that feature built in, if you do pay the extra and get those card that has them, the NVMe bays built in for the QNAP to take advantage of, the QNAP can not only take advantage of those SSDs in caching, it can use them for raw storage. That's right, you can actually utilize those 2.5 GBE ports on the device, or get a combo card that's got 10 GBE and SSD bays on it, and directly access 2 bays of SSD for fast storage and use the hard drives. Now, you can use both systems if you like. You can use SSD caching for the drives, or you can choose to utilize the SSDs for raw storage, something currently Synology doesn't offer. Synology only lets you use those SSD bays for raw storage, which is unusual really, given that the SSDs, if you install a standard 2.5-inch SATA SSD into the Synology 920, it will allow you to use the SSD as raw storage. So the potential is there for Synology to let users use SSD for raw storage, but they would rather the NVMEs be utilized for that SSD caching. Maybe things will change in DSM-7, I'm not sure. But right now, if you are going to use an SSD for caching only and you care about the internal operation speed of your NAS, chances are the Synology is going to float your boat quite a lot. But the QNAP does seem to bring a lot more options on how you utilize your NAS and how you want to interact with your data internally and externally that you just cannot ignore. Next, we can talk about software. Now, software is another dividing point between these two companies. I've compared Synology and QNAP NAS for a long time, but it's worth highlighting that in the newer generations, things have really changed. Synology used to be a brand that I would say focused on software over hardware in a big way, with QNAP focusing on hardware over software in a big way. But in 2020, the playing fields are exceptionally level. Both companies have got very well evolved software now. Both of them have got software and applications in their roll of apps, both to be installed on the NAS in the App Center and locally on mobile and desktop client devices that are just fantastic. Both of them are arriving with support of third-party applications too. I would say in terms of software, probably Synology still have the lead in terms of their apps, because they just have some apps that no one else has. Not only have they got things like Synology Chat, Synology Drive, and you know, a bunch of other applications, Active Backup Suite as well. They've got a lot of other applications that just seem to look more visually appealing. And again, their entire collaboration suite of applications allowing you to replace your Microsoft Office or Google Docs with Synology Office, replacing Dropbox and Google Drive with Synology Drive, replacing WhatsApp and Skype with Synology Chat. All of it working within the NAS is very impressive. And with lots of other applications followed after that, and again, do check out the NAS Compare article below where I go into a lot more detail about this. The applications on the Synology are probably the better overall, but the QNAP applications are more diverse. The QNAP first-party applications tick a lot of boxes, and let's not forget that a lot of the key, more exciting applications from Synology do appear to be arriving in DSM-7, coming very soon. And yet these are available now on the QNAP platform. The QNAP platform has got probably the best multi-tiered backup application I've seen yet in Hyper Backup Sync 3. The Hybrid Backup Sync 3, I should say, is easily the best backup NAS app right now. It's very user-friendly. It covers far more platforms than anyone else. And although it lacks a lot of the kind of enterprisey polish of Active Backup Suite, which is more of a backup and sync device, Hybrid Backup Sync 3 does bring a hell of a lot to the table, and to me is still the better tool overall. On top of that, QNAP's utilization of recognition, facial recognition, AI support is better. They've incorporated the facial recognition into their surveillance platform. You know, without having to buy a GPU-powered NAS, you can buy the 453D, and you can take advantage of a number of those surveillance add-ons that are only available from them. I will say you will utilize a lot of your NAS power to take advantage of them, and some of them are still in beta, but they are arriving for this NAS platform and not locked to certain models, which is something Synology have done because of them wanting the best possible performance, meaning that they've restricted it to certain levels with GPU-powered NAS. The Synology QTS platform, currently at time of recording, is QTS 4.4.2, is up against Synology's DSM 6.2 with 7 on the horizon. I say horizon, end of the year. They both provide a lot. In terms of design, I would say that once again, the Synology DSM platform is very Mac. It's all the decisions are hidden in the background, and it's a very polished user experience, slightly more responsive. The refresh does seem a little bit quicker, but you will feel it a little bit limited if you are more of a techie that wants the hard decisions, wants the configurations, wants to tinker and make things that are very bespoke to your needs. The QNAP platform is still incredibly user-friendly, and QTS does bring a lot to the table in terms of software, but it is just the teeniest bit more of a learning curve, and I really do mean a tiny bit, but you can configure it in so many more ways. And although both of them arrive with a lot of first-party software and support of third-party software, let's talk about the one that you guys probably want to know about in this video, Plex Media Server. Plex Media Server is one of these software applications that has really helped the NAS industry, helping a lot of people have their own movies, their own TV shows, their own box sets, their own music, their own photos now and more, and allow you to enjoy them in your own home without having to stream to third-party platforms that rely on internet connections, as well as choosing how and when you can watch shows. And buying something on a streaming platform never feels quite as satisfying as owning it yourself. Whether you're converting your own physical optical media into digital form on these NASs using an external DVD drive, or downloading them directly from the purchase site onto the NAS. So both of them do support Plex Media Server very well. We don't have them here in the studio, unfortunately, so we can't really make an accurate accusation as to how well they run. But what I will say, based on previous generations, such as the 453B, the 453B and the DS918 Plus, the 918 Plus did seemingly run Plex that little bit better, and that was because of the way Synology used caching technology in the background. Things have changed a lot since then, and the QNAP does arrive with a few extra things under the hood that aren't available on the QNAP, on the Synology, but I will say that between them, Plex Media Server will run very, very well on both of them. Now, I said I'd come back to an overlap on the CPU. I've mentioned it previously in other videos, but we're seeing indications that the CPU inside the 920 and the 453D, although better than its predecessor in almost every single way, does seem to handle H.265 8 and 10 bitrate media slightly, and I do mean slightly worse than its predecessor in terms of encoding and decoding. This is not a huge deal, but do check what your media collection is primarily made of. Transcoding will assist you, but if you're having a NAS with a CPU that can't handle encoding and decoding of this particular codec very, very well indeed, then you may see problems. So do double check what your media collection has before buying one of these devices, because chances are you're the user that's going to have to start looking at Pentium, i3, maybe even an i5 NAS overall. But let's get to the conclusion. Which one of these two NASs should you buy? I think I would have addressed this earlier on because it's very, very important about looking at the brands and what they bring to the table. Because how you utilize your data and how you want to access it is ultimately what's going to make you choose between these two devices. If you're going to be utilizing 1 GBE and have no plans to upgrade in the next 3 to 5 years, or you only care about the speed of the files, being them smaller files overall, on the NAS, the Synology is going to be the most appealing to you because of its improvement on the internal operations and, of course, its far more easy, friendly feel. The QNAP, on the other hand, the speed at which you access the data externally matters the most to you, and the devices with which you connect to it, not just over the network or the internet, but locally with an HDMI monitor and keyboard and mouse, directly cable to cable, connecting your PC or Mac to the NAS via a single cable. If that's what you're planning, the QNAP 453D is certainly the one for you. A comparison I will often make is comparing PC gaming with console gaming. In this analogy, the QNAP is PC gaming. You configure it the way you want. It may seem like you need a little bit of extra knowledge to get the most out of it, and I do mean a little, but the QNAP is a far more configurable platform overall, which means you can tweak it to your own bespoke needs and get the best results for you. But if you don't want to tinker, if you don't want to mess around, what you want is something that works to a certain standard and maintains that standard. It says, we will do this and we will give you this the whole time. The Synology is one for you. The Synology is console gaming. It might be a fixed frame rate. It might be that the options are far less configurable, but it will give you what it promises, and it will give it to you as soon as you press the X button. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. It overrun a bit, didn't it, today? Thank you so much for watching. If you do choose to go with one of these two NAS, do let me know which one in the comments, which one kind of earns your favour the most. Do visit the NAS Compare article in the description where I go into a lot more detail about these devices. And of course, if you are interested in NAS, do visit the guys at span.com. 25 years in the biz, they know what they are doing. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching once again, and I will see you next time.